and welcome to the third and last plenary lecture. The first time I met Professor Bortoni Ricardo, I was a young and confused student. Really young because at this moment I was in my early 20s finishing my linguistics degree. I'm really confused because in 1992 I didn't know what to do with my immediate future. Then I saw a poster in my faculty. A Brazilian professor was coming to Málaga to introduce her latest work about sociolinguistics, the urbanization of rural dialect speaker. When her speech was finished, I knew I would want to dedicate my life to research on language variation. It's true. It's true. Of course, she has never heard this anecdote before. My personal story, but when I knew Professor Bortoni Ricardo was coming to Málaga as an invited plenary speaker, I asked Dr. Villena if I could introduce her. Mainly because I want to take part in this and thank Professor Bortoni Ricardo for what she did for me. Thank you very much. In a general way, the professor is a socially compromised person. She has published several studies on sociolinguistics. Let me remind you of two. Sujeitos en ambientes virtuais o Manual de Sociolingüística. But, in my personal opinion, the most important thing is the crossover she made from theoretical sociolinguistics to the applied area of training teachers. As she herself recognized, it's an obligation for Brazilians who have had the opportunity of finishing university studies try to decrease the shockingly high level of illiteracy in Brazil. This is the objective that guides the current research of our invited plenary speaker. Her speech approaches to sociolinguistics, teaching and learning. The case of Brazil is a prime example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I thank you all for coming. Okay, I'm going to be talking about things that he's already announced. This is closer. Okay, good morning. Thank you all for coming. I will be talking about sociolinguistics in Brazil, very much as my dear colleague has announced, because it is still my main concern education in Brazil and the role of sociolinguistics in a country like ours. That's what we'll be talking about. Okay, sociolinguistics, so I called it approaches to teaching, to the sociolinguistic teaching and learning, the case of Brazil. Sociolinguistics is a field of language studies that sprang from the 20th century structural linguistics, but did not adopt one of its main assumptions inherited from the Swiss grammarian Ferdinand de Saussure under the influence of Emil Durkheim. This assumption is the distinction between the social fact, the language, and the real actuation of language, the speech. As a social fact, okay, I think we got it. As a social fact, language is a homogeneous phenomenon comprising, therefore, oppositions that could be described and analyzed. Speech, or parole, on the other hand, was the province of variation and was not amenable to regularities, so they thought. The researchers that started to call themselves sociolinguists in the 1960s wanted to search for regularities in the heterogeneous speech as well, and soon realized that the use speakers made of language was inherently varied and followed orderly patterns. Some of them simply abandoned the Saussurian dichotomy, as well as the other dichotomy, competence and performance, which was in fact a revision of the former. Actually, when they first started to call themselves sociolinguists, there was a lot of discussion. Some of them would say that sociolinguists was redundant because any linguist would be a social student, a social study student. But still, that was the name, sociolinguists. When this trend started in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, that country was deeply engaged in racial turmoil, and the African American population was fighting for their civil rights. It is therefore easy to understand why the first efforts of sociolinguistic description dealt with the variety spoken by that ethnic group. The first sociolinguist's intention was to demonstrate that the so-called Black English followed systematic and predictable linguistic rules, which could be identified by means of statistical treatment. I find this quite interesting, the use of statistics in the language studies. The alternative, as William Labov puts it, the alternative ways of producing an utterance should be reported with the proportion of cases in which that form did occur, as compared to the total number of cases in which it might have occurred. Labov 72. It's interesting to notice that statistics was widely used at that point in every social science, but not in the language sciences. It was indeed with sociolinguistics that statistics started to be used in the study of language. This one. Okay, thank you. When sociolinguistics was brought to Brazil in the middle 1970s, it found a fertile and extensive territory. I like to make a note here. Gregor Guy was there from the first beginning in the 1960s, 1970s. Yes. So he witnessed all this that I'm going to mention. He was a witness, and he was a part of that. He was one of the people involved with the beginning of sociolinguistics in Brazil. Okay, so when it was brought to Brazil in the 1970s, it found an extensive territory inhabited by a multilingual society. Brazilians claim that the only language in Brazil is Portuguese, but there are over 170 Aboriginal languages there. So it was inhabited by a multilingual society in which the European language of colonization, the Portuguese language, followed a drift quite different from its first centuries in the Iberian Peninsula. And the Portuguese was put in contact with hundreds of Aboriginal languages, and with the ones brought into the country by the large population of African slaves. In this diglossic situation, the Portuguese language became the code of the prestigious groups. And prestigious groups that are associated with high income and predominance of European background. We cannot forget, we should not forget, that access to literacy since the 16th century in Brazil has always been a scarce commodity open to these prestigious groups only. It's hard to, I feel quite sorry to say this, but that's what still happens. The circumstances of multilingualism and diglossia have contributed to a quick advance of the sociolinguistic paradigm in the country since the 1970s. Moreover, most of the Brazilian linguistics students, despite their epistemological traditions, have always been prompt to adhere to sociolinguistic assumptions, including what have been called educational sociolinguistics. I mean, the phoneticians, the phonologists, just about every researcher in linguistics are quite familiar with sociolinguistics. in Brazil. This talk is based on my understanding of the Portuguese language spoken in Brazil, and it reports to the quantitative sociolinguistic research as well as to the qualitative ethnographic tradition. I like to point out at this point that educational sociolinguistics must consider three assumptions. Okay? Must consider three assumptions. And they are, always go from the use to the theory. The first one. The second one, go from the oral to the written use of the language. And the third one, expand the student's world knowledge from the local to the universal. I will briefly discuss these assumptions. Okay, should I move? First assumption. Okay, thank you. Let's discuss the first one then. Go from the use to the theory. It is easy to understand that linguists, as other social scientists, are fond of the theory that they studied their whole life. If they are fond of it, they want to teach it, they want to discuss the theory. I don't deny that theoretical linguistics is important to comprehend human language and the hundreds of natural languages. But when a teacher enters the classroom, however, to work with literacy or to develop the reading and writing skills of the students, he or she should be interested in the uses of the language, and that is, its varieties and the most used oral and written text genres. A good way of doing this is to look for the variable rules that are found in the whole speech community, and to identify the ones that are more productive in the area where a school is located. You may remember that Brazil is a huge country, a huge territory. Some of these rules are completely opaque to Brazilian teachers, as they are always trained to deal with the so-called grammar mistakes only. Such mistakes are very much condemned by the Brazilian society since the colonial times. It's very bad in Brazil to speak bad Portuguese. To speak bad Portuguese is not to adhere to standard completely, which almost nobody does. But still, non-standard variables are very much stigmatized in our society. Among the variable rules spread all over the country, I should refer to the raising of the medium vowels, e and o, like in the word revista, magazine, revista, revista. Another spread variable is the reduction of the diphthongs with the front vowel E. I, like in beijo, beijo. Treino, treino. And the deletion of consonants in the syllable final position, like in correr, to run, correr, correr. Vou correr, vou correr. Vou correr, yes, that's it. Os jovens, os jovem. Okay. As regards this first assumption, go from the use to the theory, it's always commendable to emphasize that school first obligation is to expand the linguistic uses of the students, giving them the opportunity of access to more prestigious ways of speaking. To avoid stigmatize the variants in the students' repertoire in order not to embarrass them is a belief that resulted from misunderstanding the sociolinguistic foundation texts. And I imagine it's a phenomenon that set deep roots in a way linguistic variation was understood in Brazil. And I imagine nowhere else. But this is a serious issue in Brazilian sociolinguistics. Should we correct a student or shouldn't we? For me, of course, it's not a dilemma. I always correct them. I always teach them. Most teachers correct them, teach them, give them examples, give them paradigms, in the oral language, etc. But this is not trivial in Brazil. It's quite a dilemma. Shall teachers correct the students, or they should just ignore and not to embarrass them? So I don't know if it happens in any other places. It happens in Brazil. Turning now to our second assumption, go from oral to the written use of the language, we should keep in mind that in a society like ours, with a large number of illiterates, almost everybody speaks the language, but not all of them can write or read it. It's in the oral uses of the language that teachers should look for the linguistic traces that will guide them, both in preparing their lessons as in anticipating their students' main difficulties. The third assumption, expand the students' world knowledge from the local to the universal, is not very much discussed in the sociolinguistic literature. But it's very relevant in a society like ours, where most teachers will receive in their classrooms students with an illiterate family background. So they must be concerned, especially concerned, with students coming from the illiterate family, families with an illiterate background. In such cases, their family social life will be very circumscribed to local experiences. I've been in sociolinguistics for decades now, as you remembered. I've been in sociolinguistics for decades, and I'm seriously convinced that it's not just to tell people that some varieties are different from others. Some varieties are different from this standard Portuguese. It's not just that. It is to explain that the world view is different if a person is illiterate or if a person can rely on the written tradition. Going back, in such cases, their family social life is very circumscribed to local experiences. The teachers will then should engage themselves in presenting their students with new experiences mediated by the written tradition. So this is the key, the written tradition. Everyone in Brazil and everyone everywhere should have access to the written tradition. I'll give a very simple example. I took a couple of adolescents. I do this almost every Saturday. I took a couple of adolescents from illiterate families to the cinema to see the movie Tarzan. Before going, we worked together to find information on the original book Tarzan. And then we located the Republic of Congo and Belgium in a geographic globe. The next step was to discuss the colonization process of that African country, comparing it to the colonization process in Brazil. We could therefore work with sociolinguistics to shed light on geography and history notions. That's how I see sociolinguistics nowadays, as a key to help to shed light on our history, on the world's history, and mainly on geography. It's amazing. But if we talk to one of these kids, she will know very little beyond their house's gate. Very little. And I'm talking about children that are growing in Brasília, the capital. And so this is where sociolinguistics belong. Sociolinguistics belongs there to help them have this bigger view of the world, not just to compare language varieties. We should compare language varieties. I wouldn't say we shouldn't. We should go on comparing language varieties. But I'm more concerned with different ways of looking at the world, looking at the country. So to learn geography, to learn history, to learn arts. So, going to a close, I'm seriously convinced that the most important contributions of sociolinguistics in Brazil are to be found in devising an educational policy that, a policy that will seriously take into consideration these differences, not only language difference, cultural differences. And sociolinguistics is perfectly fitted for that. So, it should help devising an educational policy that will help the country to overcome illiteracy, thus helping in the enactment of an equalitarian society. This was it. I wanted very much, as some of you know, that I've been in sociolinguistics for quite a while. I wanted very much to share with you my own view of sociolinguistics nowadays. I thank you very much for this opportunity. In particular, I thank the 9th International Conference on Language Variation in Europe for the invitation for me to be here. Thank you.